So we're pretty close now. We can view a list of the users, we can follow and unfollow users, and we can post an image directly from our phone to our Pass server. So the final step is to allow users to view the feeds of the users that they're following. So let's get straight into that. We're going to need, of course, another view controller. So let's jump over to main storyboard. And I'm also going to add in, next to our post bar button item, I'm going to add a feed bar button item. So we'll just update that there. And then we'll add a new, and this is actually going to be a table view controller that we'll use to display our feed. The table view will allow us to show as many photos as we want, and the user can scroll down and view them all. And then we want to add in a segue from the feed button to our new view controller. Okay, now let's add a new file for our table view controller. So this is going to be a subclass of UI table view controller, and we'll call it the feed table view controller. Create it within the app, and then never forget to link it up to the view controller. And while we're there, don't forget the reuse identifier for the cell. Okay, so let's just quickly set up this feed table view controller. So as before, we'll have one section with 4 rows. We'll set the reuse identifier correctly. And then we'll set the cell text label to be equal to test. So it's always a good idea to do a quick test when you're setting up a table, because there's lots of things that can go wrong. So before you start adding in too complex code, it makes sense to just test out and make sure your table's working correctly. So let's click feed, and there we go. Wonderful. So we could do with a title on that view controller. Let's just add that in, and then we can get coding. I'll call it your feed. Okay. Now, so for this table, for the first time, we're going to need to customize the actual cells themselves. We're going to want an image within them, as well as information about who posted it and the message that they posted as well. So doing that is actually pretty straightforward. We just take our cell, stretch it to make it as big as we need, and then drag in the elements that we need, just as we would normally do. So we can drag in our image view. There we go. I'll make it a little bigger. And I'm going to set aspect fit. And then I'm going to have a couple of labels for the message. Get the positioning right. And another label for the user information. Just go down a little further. There we go. So I'm going to make that second label a little bit smaller. Not too much. And I'm going to stretch both these labels out to the edge. There we go, and center them both as well. All right, so now you might be wondering, how are we going to manage these labels? Well, what we do is we create a new file, which is going to be our final class for this project, and it's going to be a subclass of UI table view cell. So we'll call this feed table view cell. And like all the others, it'll just go straight in there. And then we're just going to create our outlets as usual. So let's look for it, feed table view cell. And here we go. So we'll start with the image view. So control drag. Ah, yes, fair point. So first off, I need to take my cell and attach our custom class to it. There we go. So change that to feed table view cell. And now we should be able to drag in to create our outlets. So the image, there we go. So I'll call this posted image. And the top label there, I'll call username label. And then the other we'll call message label. There we go. And then just to see how this will work, we'll go over to feed table view controller and see how we update that image and the two labels underneath. So now we don't just have a simple text label anymore, but an image and two labels. So what I'm going to do is create my cell, but I'm going to cast it to a feed table view cell. So that just makes it clear that it is a feed table view cell, which I know it is because I assigned the class to it. Now that means I can use those properties within it right here. So now I can take the cell and set the posted image and take the image within that. And for now, I'll just set it to our default image. So this is going to be a UI image named and then that. And we'll also set the username label and the message label. So cell.username label .text. I'll just call it username, and message label .text will be message. All right, so let's just check that out. We should now be able to see our image and our two labels, and of course we've controlled their content here from our feed table view controller file. So here we go, let's jump over into the feed, and there we go. So you can see we've got our 4 items with our images, our usernames, and our messages. Wonderful. So now all that remains is to get all the images that have been posted by users that are being followed by our user and display them there. Simple as that. So let's do that in View.Did.Load. And of course we're going to need parse to do this. And we'll start off by getting all of the users. So our first query will be a PF user query. And then we're going to take our query and find objects in background with a block. And that's going to return our usual array of objects. and an error message. Well, hopefully not an error message. And here I'm going to ignore the error for now and just check to see if we've got some objects, and if so, we'll set our users to it. And then, as before, we're going to have a users dictionary, which is going to be a string to a string, and that's going to show the username for each user ID. So it's going to enable us to get the username uniquely from the user ID. So then we're going to loop through. So we're going to look for objects in users, and then for each object we're going to attempt to create a user out of it by casting it to a PF user. So just to reiterate, we've got our objects, which is an array of objects, and we're then going to attempt to loop through that, and for each item in that array we're going to attempt to cast it to a PF user. And if we're successful, we're going to add it to the users dictionary using the object ID, which we'll need to force unwrap, but we know that there will be one because there always is for a user, and we're going to set that equal to the user username. And again, there always is a username for a user, so we can safely force unwrap that. And just quickly, just in case we end up loading this twice, I'm going to take users and clear it at the beginning. Okay, so now we've got an array containing all of our users. So next, notice I'm putting this inside the closure because we want this to happen after we've done that initial query. So now we've got our full list of users. We're going to work out which ones are followed by our user because they're the only ones that we really care about. So let's create a get followed users query, which is going to be a PF query on the class name followers. You'll remember our followers class. That just gives us all the connections between the following and the follower. And we want all the followers where the follower, spell that right, is equal to our user. So that's pf user.current object ID. And I think we just need to unwrap that again. Again, we know that we have a current user, so we're not going to have any problems there. Then we take our get followed users query and find object in the background with our good old block. And as before, we're looking for objects and error. And then once again, if let followers is equal to objects, then that means we have an objects array that we can work through. So let's loop through it. So for object in objects, and then we'll use if let, let's call this follower, is equal to object as PF object. Then we can use the follower variable as a PF object. Oh yes, and up here it should be followers rather than objects because that's already unwrapped because we've checked that it exists. Then I'm going to create a variable called the followed user, and this is going to be the follower and following. So it's the user that they're following, and I'm going to cast that to a string, which I know will work because it's a string over here in the database. And then finally, we're going to have one more query, which is going to be a query on the class name posts, which is going to be what actually gets the posts for us. So we want to query where the user ID is equal to the followed user. So we're essentially looking for all the posts that have been made by this particular user. And then we're going to find those objects in the background. Once again, objects and error. And if we have some posts, then we're going to loop through them. So we'll use object in posts. Notice I'm using object here to represent a generic type of thing that we don't know what it is. And then I'm using a more accurate description when we know more about that thing. So if we can take an object and cast it to a PF object, then we can extract all the details from it. So we want the message, and we want the image file, and we want the username as well. So let's quickly set up some arrays to store those. So we'll have messages, which is an array of strings. We'll have usernames, which again is an array of strings. And we'll have image files, which is going to be an array of PF files. And that's where we'll store our images. So then we'll just update all of those. So self.messages.append, and we want to append post message. And we'll need to cast that to a string, which again is safe because post message is definitely a string. We'll set image files and append our image to that. So object image file as a PF file. Nearly there now. And then self usernames append, and we want to get the username from the user ID. So this is where we use our user array to get that. So it's going to be user, or even self.users. And then we want to get the post and user ID as a string. There we go. Oh, and actually it will probably work as object, but let's keep this the same and use post everywhere. And I think we need to unwrap something there. Yep, there we go. Okay, so now we will have updated all three of our important arrays at once. So we don't need to worry about them being out of sync in any way. So now we can go and update our table. So table view, reload data, probably need a self in there. And almost finally, we can update this command, the self or route index path, to update with the appropriate data. So number of rows in section is now going to be the number of items in, say, messages. And here then we can use messages index path dot row to get our message. We can use usernames index path dot row to get our usernames. May need to force unwrap that. Again, I'm sure they exist because we set them all at the same time. Oh, okay. We don't need to force unwrap it. The image is slightly more complicated because, believe it or not, we haven't actually downloaded the image yet. So this PF file that we got here is just really a pointer to that particular image stored on our Parse server. So to get it, we need to take image files and index path dot row, and we need to get the data in the background. Again, with a block, with some data and an error. And now here we should have the image. So let's do a quick check to see if let downloaded image equal to, and we're going to attempt to create a UI image from this data that we've just downloaded from Parse. And if that works, I'm going to update my cell posted image dot image, and notice it's caught up now. It is auto predicting for me. It didn't do that before, but sometimes it takes a little while to connect everything. And set the image to downloaded image. And there it wants to force unwrap data, which I'm not entirely happy with doing because we're not 100% certain we're going to get some data. So we'll do a check there instead, just in case there's a problem with getting the image data. We don't want an app crash if that fails. So this actually works really well because this means that even if the images take a while to download, the usernames and messages will appear before we need to download the images. Okay. So now we want to make sure that there are some images posted by users that we follow. So at the moment we follow Rob and Kirsten. So I'm just going to do a little bit of cheating here. And I'm going to grab Rob's username or object ID, sorry, and then go back over to posts. And I'm going to change a few of these to be Rob posts. So now, if we go back over to our simulator and click on feed, with any luck, there we go. So that actually worked really quickly. We've got our image at the top there. And if we scroll down, these ones you'll remember were just the default ones. So they don't have a message, but notice that the lack of message doesn't cause a crash because it's just an empty string. It's not a variable that doesn't exist. And there we go. So we've now got all the basic functionality of Instagram. We can view other users, we can follow and unfollow them. We can post messages by getting images from the photo stream, go back, and then we can view the feed, which shows us the images that people that we follow have posted. And of course, we've got our nifty logout and login method, which enables us to quickly log in as another user and then see the users that they may or may not follow. Brilliant. So I hope you enjoyed making that app. I think just a couple of comments before we move on. The process for actually getting the feed data is not particularly efficient. So here we're downloading all of the users, and then we're downloading all of the users that are followed by our user, and then we're downloading all the posts by all of those users. So that's fine for a little demo app like this, but if we had hundreds of thousands of users, that system would never work. So you'd need to have a more efficient way of just getting recent posts by the users that were followed by the current user. You'd probably want to keep those users stored permanently on your app, so you didn't need to get them every time. Also, we haven't actually checked that these are in any particular order. So we haven't stored the date, even though it is actually stored automatically, so we could use that. But it would be reasonably trivial to change this code to show posts in date order. Beyond that, there's obviously a huge amount of things you could extend this app to. You could allow users to message each other, to share videos, all sorts of other things, but we're going to leave it there. And now we're going to move on to an even more complex clone. So using parse server and all these objects and queries, but this time we're going to integrate maps and user location, which we're going to name of Uber. I look forward to seeing you there for that in the next section.